They laughed when she stepped off the armored transport. Forward Operating Base Sentinel materialized from the pre-dawn darkness, like a fortress carved from desperation. 0430 hours. The convoy ground to a halt in a cloud of ancient dust, diesel fumes mixing with the thin mountain air of the Afghan border. 72 hours remained before the scheduled withdrawal. 72 hours to hold a defensive perimeter that had already swallowed 2 reconnaissance teams whole. Captain Garrett Thorne stood at the command post, arms crossed over his tactical vest, watching the transport's rear hatch drop with a metallic groan that echoed across the narrow valley. The terrain stretched below them like a surgeon's diagram of vulnerability. A dried riverbed snaking through scattered boulders, ridgelines pressing in from both sides like the walls of a trap slowly closing. That's our reinforcement? Sergeant Lyle Dalton squinted at the manifest on his tablet, then back at the emerging figures. His voice carried the particular skepticism of a man who'd survived 23 years in the Army by trusting nothing and questioning everything. The scar bisecting his left eyebrow, a souvenir from Fallujah, seemed to deepen as his frown intensified. We requested a sniper team. They sent us one. 7 soldiers emerged into the half-light, 6 men in their 30s and 40s, their faces weathered by deployments that had long since stopped counting as adventures and started counting as survival. Confident strides, equipment slung with the casual efficiency of professionals who'd done this 100 times before. They moved like they owned the ground beneath their boots. Then her. Corporal Alara Strand couldn't have been more than 25. Medium height, lean build, carrying her rifle case with both hands instead of slinging it over her shoulder like the others. Her uniform was pristine in a way that screamed one word to every man watching: new. Her dark blonde hair, cut to regulation length, was tied back in a way that caught the first rays of dawn creeping over the eastern ridge. No swagger, no attempt to match the confident body language of her male counterparts. Just focused, deliberate movement as she stepped onto the gravel and immediately began visually cataloging the base's defensive positions. "You've got to be kidding me." Dalton's voice carried farther than he intended, cutting through the morning quiet like a knife through silk. She looked up once, briefly. Gray eyes, the color of winter storms over Montana mountains, scanned the perimeter with a precision that suggested she was recording rather than merely observing. Then her gaze returned to her equipment. No reaction, no defensive posture, no attempt to prove anything to anyone, just absolute focus on checking her gear with the methodical attention most people reserve for diffusing explosives. Lieutenant Hayes Brennan, the base's senior marksman, approached with his arms crossed and his jaw set. 35 years old, Ranger qualified, 2 combat deployments, and absolutely certain he knew what he was looking at. "Which one of you is Corporal Strand?" "That would be me, sir." Her voice was steady, unremarkable. No attempt to sound tougher or softer than she was. Just professional clarity that carried without shouting. "Your file says you qualified expert at the sniper course." Brennan's tone made it abundantly clear what he thought of that particular accomplishment. "Fort Benning graduation doesn't mean much out here." "No, sir, it doesn't." The answer caught him off guard. Most rookies would have puffed up, tried to prove themselves with words, recited their qualifications like a resume. She just stood there, weapon case in hand, waiting for actual instructions. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 30. Captain Thorne joined them, his boots crunching on gravel. 42 years old, command presence honed through 12 years of leading men in places that didn't make the news anymore. He scanned the new arrival with visible disappointment, the kind that settles in when reality fails to meet even modest expectations. "We're holding a defensive position for 72 hours while the main force completes withdrawal through the southern pass. Every shooter counts." He paused, and in that pause lived all the skepticism he was too professional to voice directly. "You'll be assigned to Sector 4 with Sergeant Dalton's team." Sector 4. Everyone knew what that meant. The quiet sector. The position farthest from expected contact zones, tucked away on the western ridge where the terrain dropped off toward a dried riverbed that hadn't seen water in a decade. The place where commanders positioned personnel they didn't trust with anything critical. The military equivalent of being sent to sit at the children's table during Thanksgiving dinner. Understood, sir. As she gathered her equipment, voices drifted from the nearby sandbag wall. Not quite whispered, not quite loud enough to be confrontational. Just that middle range where men say what they really think while maintaining plausible deniability. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel now. Diversity quota made it all the way out here. What's next? Participation trophies for firefights? Give her the radio watch. At least she can't screw that up. Corporal Ilara Strand heard every word. She'd heard variations of them for 3 years, since the day she first showed up at sniper school and watched instructors' faces transform from professional neutrality to barely concealed doubt. Since the day she outshot half her class and overheard it attributed to luck, beginner's fortune, favorable wind conditions, anything except skill. Since the day her first confirmed kill during advanced training was dismissed as the exception that proves the rule. She'd stopped trying to change minds with words around the same time she'd stopped reacting to the doubt in people's eyes. Words were cheap currency in a world that measured value in accuracy at distance. Her rifle case clicked open. Inside, the M110 semi-automatic sniper system lay in custom-cut foam, every surface meticulously maintained. The 7.62 by 51 millimeters NATO rifle represented the pinnacle of modern American sniper technology. 20-inch barrel, adjustable stock, Leupold scope with variable magnification. But mounted on top, incongruous among the modern tactical equipment, sat a scope that didn't belong. Older, custom-built. The finish worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it through decades of use. Her grandfather's scope. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Strand had built it himself during Desert Storm. Custom glass, hand-fitted to his M40A1, carried through 52 confirmed kills across Kuwait and Somalia. He'd given it to her the day she enlisted, making her promise to mount it on whatever rifle she carried. "This glass has seen things most people never will," he'd said, his weathered hands placing it in hers with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "Now it's yours. Don't waste it." She'd bought the cleaning kit with her own money during basic training, practiced breathing techniques in her bunk until they became as natural as her heartbeat, studied ballistics manuals while others played cards in the barracks, memorizing wind values and bullet drop charts until the mathematics lived in her muscle memory rather than her conscious mind. Not because she wanted to prove anything, not because she was trying to shatter glass ceilings or make political statements, because she refused to be the reason someone died. Sergeant Lyle Dalton appeared beside her, his stocky frame blocking the rising sun. 44 years old, scar through his eyebrow, and the particular weariness that came from caring too much for too long. "You're with me. Sector 4 is on the western ridge. Light duty, mostly observation." He paused and something flickered behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like concern wrapped in layers of professional distance. "Try not to touch anything." "Yes, Sergeant." He walked away without another word, and she followed, her boots finding purchase on the rocky incline. Behind her, Dalton's voice muttered to Brennan, probably thinking she was out of earshot. 72 hours. Just keep her out of the way and we'll be fine." Ilara said nothing. She'd been underestimated before. It usually didn't end well for the enemy. Sector 4 overlooked a dried riverbed 200 meters below, bordered by scattered boulders that cast long shadows in the strengthening daylight. Dead vegetation clung to life in patches, brown and brittle, rustling in the slight breeze that carried the smell of dust and distant diesel. To the north, sectors 1 through 3 formed the main defensive arc, where Thorne had positioned his most experienced shooters, machine gun nests anchored at key terrain features, Mortar teams dug in with pre-plotted firing solutions, overlapping fields of fire that should theoretically turn any assault into a killing ground. Sector 4 had Ilara, Sergeant Dalton, and 2 riflemen. Private First Class Cade Hollister looked impossibly young, 20 years old, baby-faced, with a Wisconsin accent that turned certain words into musical notes. He watched Ilara with undisguised curiosity as she moved into position, the kind of curiosity that bordered on confusion. "You really a sniper?" "That's what my orders say." She set down her rifle case and began unpacking with systematic precision. "It's just—" He trailed off, suddenly aware he was about to say something that couldn't be unsaid. "You seem young," finished Specialist Rhett Calloway. 29 years old, quiet in the way that suggested he'd seen things that made talking feel pointless. He spoke maybe 10 words per hour, and each one carried the weight of careful consideration. From his position 10 meters away, he glanced over, his weathered face neutral. "She qualified, or she wouldn't be here. Leave it alone." Dalton pointed to a depression between 2 rock formations, a natural fighting position that offered both protection and clear sight lines. "Set up there. You've got clear view down the riverbed and across to the eastern slope. Anything moves, you call it in before you even think about shooting. Clear?" "Clear, Sergeant." She moved into position, methodically assembling her shooting platform. Sandbag rest positioned to eliminate weapon cant. Range cards prepared with military precision. Backup ammunition stored within arm's reach but protected from dust and sun. Her movements were efficient, practiced, no wasted motion. Every action served a purpose. Every item placed exactly where it needed to be for instant access. Hollister watched from his fighting position. "I mean, you really qualified expert?" "Fort Benning, yes." "It's just—" Again he stopped, trapped between curiosity and the growing awareness that this conversation was heading toward uncomfortable territory. Calloway's gravel voice cut through. "She qualified expert. That means she can shoot. That's all that matters. Leave it." Ilara sketched her range card in silence, the mechanical pencil moving across the weatherproof paper with practiced precision. Riverbed curves northeast at 180 meters. Cluster of boulders at 310 meters. Tree line edge at 475 meters. She memorized each measurement, each potential firing lane, each piece of dead ground where an enemy could move unseen. The tactical briefing had been clear as crystal. Enemy forces were massing for a final push before the withdrawal completed. Intelligence estimated 200 combatants, possibly more. They'd probe for weaknesses first, test the defenses with small unit actions, then commit to a full assault on whichever sector looked most vulnerable. Ilara studied the terrain with different eyes than her companions. They saw obstacles in cover, places to hide, positions to defend, threats to monitor. She saw geometry, angles of fire measured in degrees and minutes, dead zones where ballistics and terrain conspired to create safety, positions that looked secure but weren't, where a competent enemy marksman could establish dominance. And she saw the problem that nobody else was seeing. Sergeant Dalton, he looked up from his radio check, irritated at being interrupted during equipment validation. His scar seemed to deepen as his frown intensified. "What?" "That outcropping at 280 meters, eastern slope." She gestured toward a rock formation that jutted from the hillside like a broken tooth, positioned at an angle that offered commanding views of the valley below. Someone with a technical weapon could set up there and hit sectors 2 and 3 from a flanking position. Dalton squinted at the rocks she indicated, his hands shading his eyes against the climbing sun. Several seconds passed. "That's outside our sector." "Yes, Sergeant, but Sector 3's position doesn't have line of sight to it. The angle's wrong. They're focused on the riverbed approach, not the eastern high ground. And Sector 2 can't traverse their weapons that far east without exposing their flank to the northern approaches. That outcropping creates a dead zone in our defensive coverage. If the enemy positions a technical there, Even just a truck-mounted machine gun, they could enfilade both positions simultaneously. His voice hardened, took on that particular edge that sergeants developed when junior personnel overstepped. I didn't ask for tactical analysis. I asked you to watch your assigned sector. Do that. She wanted to press the issue. The outcropping was textbook. Any competent enemy force would identify it within hours of reconnaissance. It offered elevation, defilade from return fire, and perfect angles to support an assault on the main defensive positions. A single technical weapon positioned there, a Toyota pickup with a PKM or DSHK mounted in the bed, could suppress both sectors 2 and 3 while friendly forces advanced through the riverbed. It was the kind of position that decided battles. But pressing wouldn't change his mind. It would only confirm his existing belief that she was overstepping her boundaries, trying to prove something, acting above her pay grade. So she did what she'd learned to do over 3 years of similar interactions. Yes, Sergeant. She returned to her range card, but added a small notation in the margin. Outcropping, 280 meters, enfilade threat, unobserved. Then she continued her terrain analysis, saying nothing more, observing everything. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in harsh contrasts of light and shadow, Ilara noticed other details. Dust patterns on the far ridge that suggested recent disturbance. Vegetation near the dried riverbed that showed signs of being moved or displaced within the past 48 hours. Certain rocks that appeared to have been repositioned, their clean sides exposed to the sun in ways that natural weathering wouldn't produce. The subtle tracks of careful movement, the kind that came from professionals who understood fieldcraft but couldn't completely erase their presence from an environment this stark. Someone had scouted this position, recently, methodically. She marked it in her notebook without speaking, added coordinates, approximate times based on vegetation recovery rates, likely observation points based on sight lines to the base's defensive positions. The picture forming in her mind was clear and deeply concerning. This wasn't going to be a probing attack. This was going to be a planned assault by an enemy that had done their homework. By noon, the temperature hit 98 degrees. Hollister complained constantly about the heat, the dust, the boredom, the complete unfairness of being stuck in Sector 4 while the real soldiers held the main line. Calloway dozed in brief intervals, the practiced sleep of a combat veteran who'd learned to rest whenever possible, because you never knew when the next opportunity would come. Dalton rotated between their positions, maintaining watch discipline, but clearly not expecting any contact in this sector. His body language radiated the assumption that this posting was punishment detail, for him as much as for his team. Ilara stayed perfectly still, her eye periodically returning to her scope, cataloging every change in the landscape. A bird landing on a boulder at 350 meters, the way shadows shifted as the sun tracked across the sky, creating and eliminating firing lanes. The subtle heat shimmer that would affect bullet trajectory at longer ranges. She wasn't just observing, she was building a three-dimensional model of the battlefield in her mind, understanding it at a level that transcended simple visual recognition. At 1420 hours, she spotted movement. Far tree line, 520 meters distant. Just a flash, fabric maybe, or a piece of equipment catching sunlight at exactly the wrong angle for exactly the wrong fraction of a second. There and gone so quickly that questioning whether she'd actually seen it would be reasonable. But she had seen it. Human movement had a particular quality, a rhythm that distinguished it from animals or wind-blown vegetation. Possible contact, far tree line. Her voice was quiet, professional, pitched to carry to Dalton's position without shouting across the sector. Dalton lifted his binoculars, scanning the area she'd indicated. 5 seconds. 10. 15. I don't see anything. It was brief, Sergeant. Edge of the vegetation, approximately 520 meters. Strand. He lowered the binoculars, and his voice carried that particular tone of strained patience. The heat plays tricks out here. Mirages, shimmer, reflection off rocks. Stay focused on your sector, not on ghosts 500 meters out. But it hadn't been a trick. She'd seen the shape, recognized the movement pattern. Human, deliberate, professional reconnaissance. They were being observed, studied, mapped, and nobody believed. The memory hit her without warning, triggered by the taste of dust and dismissal. Age 6, Montana, her grandfather's ranch sprawling across 300 acres of high country where the wind carried stories from distant mountains. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Strand, retired USMC, standing behind her as she struggled to hold the rifle steady. Not a toy, not a .22 plinking rifle. His actual M40A1, the weapon he'd carry through Desert Storm, through Kuwait City's rubble, through firefights that he never talked about, but that lived behind his eyes like permanent shadows. Tin can on that fence post, Alara. 300 yards. You see it? She could barely see the fence post, let alone the can balanced on top of it. I think so, Grandpa. Don't think. Look. Let your eyes adjust. The world will tell you what you need to know if you're patient enough to listen. She'd stared through the scope until her eye watered, until the distant fence post resolved into clarity, until the tin can became a definable target rather than a suggestion of metal against wood. I see it. Good. Now forget everything except that can. Forget me. Forget the rifle. Forget yourself. There's only the target and the space between you. That space has rules. Wind, gravity, temperature, all trying to push your bullet off course. Your job is to understand those rules better than they understand themselves. She'd missed that first shot by 2 feet, the second by 1 foot, the third by 6 inches. By the 10th shot, she'd hit the can, and the sound of it pinging off the fence post had made her whoop with joy. Her grandfather hadn't smiled. He just nodded once, the way he nodded at everything important. It's not about the gun, Elara. It's about seeing what others miss. Most people look at that fence post and see 300 yards of impossible. You look at it and see geometry. That's not something I can teach you. Either you see it or you don't. You see it. Those afternoons had been sacred, just her and Grandpa. No little cousins demanding attention. No adults telling her to be quieter, more cooperative, less intense. Just targets and mathematics and the profound satisfaction of hitting what she aimed at. A world that made sense, where effort directly translated to results, where nobody could argue with a bullet hole in exactly the right place. Age 14, high school, the rifle team tryout that should have been routine. Coach Patterson had been kind about it, which somehow made it worse. Sorry, honey, but we've never had a girl on the team. It's just, the boys might not be comfortable with it. You understand, right? Maybe try track? I hear the girls' track team is looking for distance runners. She'd shot in unsanctioned competitions that year. Individual matches where gender didn't matter because you were competing against the target, not against opinions. State championship, shooting independently, no school affiliation. First place. Trophy almost as tall as she was. She'd had her picture taken for the local paper, standing alone with her hardware, no team behind her, no coach beside her. The victory had felt hollow. Vindication without validation. Proof that came too late to change anything that mattered. Age 19. Army recruiter's office in Billings. The smile had faded when she said, "Sniper school." That particular laugh, the one adults give children with impossible dreams, had followed her through basic training, through infantry school, through every qualification that should have proven she belonged. She'd qualified expert on every weapon system they'd put in her hands. ASVAB scores in the 98th percentile. 7-minute mile with full pack. Exceeded every standard, met every requirement, outperformed half the male recruits in her basic training class. And still, at every level, The doubt followed her like a shadow she couldn't shed. Not enough combat experience. Too young. Too small. Too female. Every obstacle framed as concern for her safety, for unit cohesion, for maintaining standards. Never mind that she'd outshot men who'd been in the Army for a decade. Never mind that her scores were higher than half the sniper school instructors. Never mind that she'd done everything asked of her, and then some. The doubt persisted, right up until the moment bullets started flying. Because downrange, doubt died fast. Downrange, the only thing that mattered was whether you could make the shot when someone's life depended on it. The day crawled forward with the particular tedium of military operations. Long stretches of nothing, punctuated by brief moments of equipment maintenance and position improvement. Hollister ran through his rifle magazines, checking spring tension and feed angles. Calloway reinforced his fighting position with additional sandbags, building fields of fire that anticipated threats from multiple directions. Dalton maintained radio communication with the command post, reporting negative contact at regular intervals, his voice carrying the boredom of a man going through motions he performed 1,000 times before. Ilara used the time to refine her range estimation. She'd pick a rock, estimate the distance, then verify it using her scope's ranging reticle. 315 meters, 420 meters, 560 meters. Building confidence not in her ability to guess, but in her ability to know with certainty. Wind value. She watched dust patterns, vegetation movement, heat shimmer intensity. Calculated holds for various ranges, various wind speeds. Built the ballistic solutions in her mind until they became automatic, reflexive, faster than conscious thought. At 1800 hours, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the valley in long shadows and golden light, Dalton finally spoke directly to her. "You're good with that rifle." Not a compliment exactly, more like a reluctant observation that surprised him. "Where'd you learn to handle equipment like that?" "My grandfather taught me, Sergeant. Started when I was 6. "Military?" "Marine Corps. Scout sniper." Something shifted in Dalton's expression. Not quite respect, but recognition. One professional acknowledging another's lineage. "Which conflict?" "Desert Storm. Somalia. 52 confirmed kills between both deployments." Dalton was quiet for a moment, processing that information, recalculating his assumptions. "And he taught you to shoot?" "Every weekend until I enlisted. Said it wasn't about the weapon, said it was about seeing what others miss." She paused, then added quietly, "He died 2 years ago, while I was in sniper school. I was going to call him after graduation, tell him I made it through, but he had a stroke 3 days before the ceremony. By the time I got emergency leave approved, he was already gone." "I'm sorry." Dalton's voice carried genuine sympathy, the kind that came from personal experience with loss. He looked like he wanted to say more, but settled for, "He'd be proud. Making it through sniper school, that's no small thing." "Thank you, Sergeant." The sun set. Temperature dropped 20 degrees within an hour, the desert exchanging brutal heat for bitter cold with no middle ground. Stars emerged in numbers impossible to see from anywhere with significant light pollution, the Milky Way sprawling across the sky like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. At 2100 hours, Ilara took the first watch of the night rotation. Dalton and Hollister settled into their sleeping positions, while Calloway maintained a relaxed alertness, not quite asleep but not fully awake, conserving energy with the efficiency of experience. She switched her optic to night vision mode, the world transforming into shades of green and shadow. The dried riverbed became a darker ribbon cutting through gray terrain. Boulder fields registered as cold masses, their heat signature long since bled into the night sky. And there, at the edge of her perception, movement. Thermal signatures. Brief. Organized. 400 meters out, maybe more, moving in patterns that suggested coordination rather than random animal behavior. She watched for 15 minutes, tracking the shapes as they moved through dead ground, utilizing terrain features in ways that demonstrated training and discipline. They weren't trying to approach the base. They were observing it, mapping firing positions, counting defenses, professional reconnaissance. She considered reporting it, lifted her radio, then hesitated. Dalton would dismiss it. Heat signatures from rocks cooling after sunset. Animals, goats perhaps, or wild dogs. Desert mirages didn't stop at sundown. They just changed form. She could already hear his response, already knew how the conversation would play out. She'd be the jumpy rookie crying wolf at shadows, confirming every doubt they'd ever had about her presence here. So she documented it instead. Coordinates in her notebook, movement patterns, estimated number of personnel, times and azimuths. Built a picture of enemy activity that nobody else was seeing, recorded in neat handwriting that her grandfather would have recognized. He'd kept similar notebooks during Desert Storm, pages of observations that seemed meaningless until the pattern emerged, until the individual data points connected to form a larger picture. The enemy was preparing, not for tomorrow, for soon. They'd done their reconnaissance, identified weaknesses, mapped the defensive positions. Now they were conducting final verification, confirming their intelligence, preparing for an assault that would hit exactly where and when the defenders were most vulnerable. At 0200 hours, Calloway relieved her for the middle watch. She tried to sleep, but couldn't. The adrenaline of observation had triggered something primal in her hindbrain, the combat instinct that recognized danger even when conscious thought couldn't articulate it. She lay in her sleeping position, eyes closed but every nerve alive to the night sounds around her. The slight wind rushing through rock formations, distant mechanical sounds from the base's generator, the occasional radio traffic from other sectors reporting negative contact. All quiet, nothing to report. But something was wrong. The night felt wrong. Too quiet, perhaps, or not quiet in the right way. Like the universe was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At 0315 hours, something did. No warning, no probing fire, no gradual buildup of contact, just sudden, overwhelming violence. The explosion that ripped through Sector 2 turned night into day for 3 seconds. The eastern machine gun nest, the anchor of the northern defensive arc, positioned on high ground with interlocking fields of fire, simply ceased to exist. The pressure wave rolled across the valley like thunder, shaking dust from rock formations, rattling equipment, hitting Elara's chest like a physical blow. Tracer rounds followed immediately, not random fire, not panicked shooting. Precisely coordinated streams of luminescent death converging on defensive positions with terrifying accuracy. Red tracers, enemy fire, sliced through darkness like laser shows at concerts. But these lights brought death instead of entertainment. They originated from positions that shouldn't have been able to see Sector 2, from angles that shouldn't have existed, from locations that suggested the enemy knew exactly where every defensive position was located. Contact! Contact! All sectors, we are under attack! Captain Thorne's voice erupted over the radio, already strained, already shifting into the clipped cadence of a commander trying to impose order on chaos. Elara was rolling into her firing position before her conscious mind caught up with her body's reflexive response. Weapon up, eye to scope, night vision activated, world narrowing to the circle of green-tinted vision that would define the next few hours. Muzzle flashes erupted everywhere, the dried riverbed, the eastern slope, positions that shouldn't have had clear lines of fire but somehow did. She'd been right. They'd mapped everything. Every blind spot, every weakness, every position where defenders would think they were safe, but weren't. This wasn't an opportunistic assault. This was a surgical strike executed by an enemy that had invested days in preparation. Sector 4, what do you see? Dalton's voice, sharp with sudden alertness, cut through the chaos. Elara's scope swept the riverbed below. The image that resolved made her stomach drop. Multiple shooters in the riverbed, 180 to 250 meters, At least 15. They're advancing under covering fire from another explosion. Sector 1 this time. Then another. The distinctive crump of mortar rounds finding their targets. Can you engage? Dalton's question carried urgency that hadn't been there before. The shift from skeptical supervisor to desperate commander happening in real time. Her crosshairs settled on a figure directing others with hand signals. Clearly a team leader, organizing the assault, coordinating fire and movement with professional competence. 220 meters, slight downhill angle, minimal wind. She'd made this shot 100 times in training, could make it now in her sleep. I have a target. Fire team leader, 220 meters. Negative, do not fire. Sector 4 is designated observation only. You'll give away your position. Her finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself. Every instinct screamed at her to take the shot. The enemy leader was organizing a flanking maneuver that would roll up Sector 3 within minutes. She could see it developing. The hand signals, the movement patterns, the textbook small unit tactics that would exploit the gap in the defensive line that she tried to warn them about. Sergeant, they're moving on Sector 3's flank. I can interdict. I said negative. That's an order, Corporal. She watched through her scope as the enemy fire team leader directed his forces with brutal efficiency. Professional, experienced, exactly the kind of target that needed to be eliminated first in any engagement. The kind of loss that would disrupt enemy operations, create confusion, buy friendly forces time to respond. But she held fire, not because Dalton ordered it, not because she doubted the shot, but because she understood something he didn't yet. If she fired now and missed, unlikely but possible, she'd have revealed Sector 4's position for nothing. If she fired now and hit, Dalton would find a way to blame her for disobeying orders, would pull her off the line, would prove every doubt he'd ever had about her. She needed to wait for the moment when everyone would understand that her shot wasn't insubordination. It was survival. Sectors 1 and 3 returned fire, but their angles were wrong. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly, using terrain that Alara had flagged 12 hours earlier. The dried riverbed provided defilade from direct fire. The boulder fields offered covered approaches, and that outcropping on the eastern slope, the one she'd warned about, the one Dalton had dismissed, sat empty but perfect, waiting. Then, like a nightmare becoming real, she heard it. The vehicle roared up the eastern slope, exactly where she'd predicted, exactly where she'd warned them, settling into position at 280 meters, with the machine gunner already traversing his weapon towards Sector 3's exposed flank. Technical on the eastern outcropping, she transmitted with forced calm, every syllable precise despite adrenaline flooding her system. Sector 3, you have incoming fire from your 4 o'clock. The warning came seconds too late. The PKM opened up. 700 rounds per minute of 7.62 by 54R ammunition tearing through Sector 3's position. Sandbags exploded into clouds of dirt and fabric. Return fire ceased as men dove for cover that wasn't there. The sustained burst, 10 seconds, 12, 15, transformed a fighting position into a casualty collection point. 3 is hit! 3 is hit! Someone screamed over the radio. Not words, just sound. The universal language of men watching friends die. Ilara's crosshairs centered on the technical's gunner, watching him work the weapon with practiced efficiency. 280 meters, uphill angle approximately 15 degrees, slight crosswind from the west. Her breathing slowed automatically, heart rate dropping as training overrode fear, as her body entered the zone that her grandfather had taught her existed, that place where conscious thought stepped aside and let competence take over. Strand, Dalton's voice came from right beside her, low and intense. I swear to God, if you fire... She watched Sector 3's position taking sustained fire, watched soldiers scrambling for cover, watched the tactical situation deteriorating by the second. The technical's gunner was reloading, feeding a fresh belt into the weapon. 5 seconds before he'd open fire again. 4 seconds before 3 men died. 3 seconds before their defensive line collapsed. 2 seconds before the decision point passed forever. "Strand!" Dalton shouted, no longer trying to maintain noise discipline, his voice carrying equal parts command and desperation. 1 second. Ilara held her fire. Not because Dalton ordered it, not because she doubted the shot, because she understood that men were dying, and she had the power to stop it. And the only thing standing between her and saving their lives was permission from someone who didn't understand what she could do. The machine gun roared again. This time it found its mark. Through her scope, she watched the impact, watched bodies jerking, watched defensive positions collapsing. The radio frequency dissolved into overlapping transmissions, damage reports, ammunition counts, desperate calls for supporting fire that wasn't coming, medical evacuation requests that couldn't be fulfilled while under fire. Another explosion. Sector 1 this time, the mortar team that had been pre-positioned to provide indirect fire support, now taking direct hits themselves. 1 is compromised, mortar team is down, falling back to secondary positions. Captain Thorne's voice cut through, tight with controlled panic. "All sectors, hold your positions. If we lose the high ground, they'll cut us off from the evacuation route. Hold your ground." But holding ground required ammunition, and ammunition required resupply, and resupply required people who were currently being shredded by coordinated fire from an enemy that had planned this assault down to the second. Ilara's scope tracked the battlefield, cataloging disaster after disaster. The enemy wasn't just attacking, they were systematically dismantling the defense, fire team by fire team, position by position, exactly as they'd planned. Exactly as she'd known they would if they positioned a technical weapon on that outcropping. Dalton pressed his back against the rock wall, his face pale in the moonlight and tracer glow. The scar through his eyebrow seemed deeper, darker, a visual representation of stress carving itself into his features. "Where the hell did they come from?" "The positions I marked, Sergeant." Ilara's voice was quiet, factual, without accusation or anger, just statement of observable reality. "They've been scouting us for days." He didn't respond. Maybe he was too overwhelmed to process it. Maybe he just didn't want to admit she'd been right when it no longer mattered. Admission of error wouldn't bring back the machine gun nest in Sector 2. Wouldn't restore the men in Sector 3 to fighting capability. Hollister was firing short bursts down into the riverbed. Not aimed fire, exactly. More the desperate need to feel like he was doing something, contributing somehow, not just waiting to die. Calloway remained calm, selecting targets, conserving ammunition, professional to the last. "Sector 4, this is Thorne." The captain's voice carried over the tactical frequency, strained but still maintaining command presence. "We need eyes on that technical. Can you get an angle?" Dalton grabbed his radio. "Negative, sir. We don't have the equipment to engage at that range." "I can take the shot," Ilara said it quietly, matter of fact, the same tone she'd used to report weather conditions or ammunition status. "Strand, I already told you." "Sergeant, they're killing us." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. The sound of sustained machine gun fire from the eastern outcropping provided all the emphasis her words needed. "That technical will wipe out Sector 3 completely in the next 2 minutes. After that, it'll traverse to Sector 2, then Sector 1. We'll lose the entire northern perimeter." "You're not authorized." "Then authorize me." The explosion that interrupted their argument came from Sector 3. Direct hit. The screaming that followed made Ilara's jaw clench so hard her teeth ached. Men she'd never met, whose names she didn't know, dying because professionals who should have known better had ignored a junior soldier's tactical analysis. Dalton stared at her. His hand trembled on the radio. 23 years in the Army, and for the first time in his career, he had no idea what to do. The protocol said one thing, Reality demanded another, and the gap between them was filled with the sound of his people dying. "Can you make that shot?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if asking quietly made it less real, less of a decision that would define the rest of his career. Ilara's gray eyes met his, steady, certain, the same eyes that her grandfather had recognized at age 6, when he'd first put a rifle in her hands and realized he was looking at something rare. "I won't miss." He held her gaze for 3 seconds that felt like hours. In those 3 seconds, she watched him age, watched him confront every assumption he'd made about her, about himself, about what mattered when people were dying. Then he lifted the radio to his mouth. "Thorn, Sector 4, we have a shooter who thinks she can hit that technical." A pause. Then Thorn's voice, confusion evident even through the radio's compression. "She?" "Corporal Strand, sir, the new sniper." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Ilara could hear gunfire over Thorn's open microphone, could hear him breathing hard, making calculations, weighing options that all looked bad. "Permission granted. Take the shot." Ilara settled into her position with the deliberate calm of someone who'd practiced this exact sequence of movements 10,000 times. Sandbag adjusted, stock pressed firm against her shoulder, eye to scope. The world beyond the optics circle ceased to exist. No radio chatter, no explosions, no screaming, just the target and the mathematics required to reach it. 280 meters. The Technical's gunner worked a PKM with professional efficiency, traversing the weapon for another devastating burst into Sector 3. She could see his body language through the scope, the confident movements of someone who believed he was operating from a position of complete tactical superiority. Her finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. Smooth, deliberate, no hesitation, because hesitation was how you missed. And missing wasn't an option when lives hung in the balance, measured by fractions of seconds. "Strand." Dalton's voice came from beside her, barely a whisper now. All the command authority drained away, replaced by something that sounded almost like prayer. "We're counting on you." She knew. She'd always known. From the moment she'd first picked up her grandfather's rifle at age 6. From the first time she'd looked through a scope and understood that distance wasn't an obstacle, it was just a problem with a mathematical solution. She'd been training for this moment her entire life, even when nobody believed the moment would ever come. The rifle's report cracked through the night, distinctive even amid the chaos of sustained combat. Then Dalton's voice, filled with something between shock and reverence. "Holy shit, she got him." But Ilara was already tracking her next target, movement behind the Technical. Another figure emerging from the truck's cab, reaching for the PKM, trying to get the weapon back into action. Smart, disciplined. The kind of enemy that didn't quit just because one man fell. The kind that would keep coming until you made it impossible for them to continue. She fired again. The figure dropped before his hands reached the weapon. "Confirmed kill," Thorne's voice snapped over the radio. Command discipline reasserting itself, even as surprise colored his tone. "Sector 4, is that Technical neutralized?" Ilara kept her eye to the scope, scanning for additional threats around the vehicle. No further movement. The defensive coordination that had been collapsing under overwhelming fire suddenly found structure again, found purpose, found the possibility of survival. The enemy force in the riverbed, suddenly without their supporting weapon, lost the cohesion they'd maintained during the initial assault. The attack that had been methodically destroying the defensive line faltered as combatants realized their carefully planned operation had just encountered an unexpected variable. Men who'd been advancing with confidence dove for cover, reassessing, trying to understand where the shots had come from and whether their other positions were equally vulnerable. Ilara's scope tracked across the battlefield, identifying targets with cold precision. Not anger, not hatred, just the professional assessment of threats that needed to be eliminated in order of tactical priority. Fire team leader, 230 meters, the same one she'd wanted to shoot 20 minutes ago, the one Dalton had forbidden her to engage. He was gesturing frantically now, trying to rally his scattered forces, attempting to restore the momentum that two well-placed shots had stolen. She centered the crosshairs on his chest. The rifle bucked. He went down. Jesus Christ, she's dropping them like tin cans. Someone breathed over the radio, awe evident even through combat stress. Another target. Spotter position on the eastern slope, 340 meters, directing mortar fire onto the remaining defensive positions. Longer range, wind compensation required. She could feel the slight breeze on her face, see it moving dust patterns in her peripheral vision, translated into the mental calculation of holdover. Not conscious math anymore, just instinct built from thousands of practice shots, muscle memory that bypassed thought entirely. She adjusted, breathed, fired. The spotter tumbled backward off his perch. "Who the hell is that shooting?" A voice Alara didn't recognize, probably from the reserve positions finally moving up to reinforce the main line. Lieutenant Brennan's voice answered, and she caught something in his tone that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. Something that might have been respect. Sector 4, the new girl. The new girl. 4 kills in 90 seconds. The enemy advance that had been rolling over defensive positions like an avalanche suddenly stalled completely. Combatants diving for cover, their carefully rehearsed assault plan collapsing into desperate attempts to survive against a threat they hadn't anticipated and couldn't locate. Dalton stared at her, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something approaching awe. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" "Fort Benning, Sergeant." She didn't look away from her scope, didn't pause in her systematic scan of the battlefield. Like my file said, she didn't wait for his response, didn't need validation or acknowledgement. Already her mind was processing the next phase of the engagement. The technical was eliminated, the fire team leader was down, the spotter was neutralized, but the enemy still had numbers, still had momentum even if that momentum had faltered. They'd regroup, adapt, come at them from a different angle. Professional fighters didn't quit just because their plan hit complications. They adjusted and continued until you made continuation impossible. New muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line at 475 meters. Someone with tactical sense had pulled back to extreme range, distance they assumed was beyond the effective reach of standard infantry weapons. Not a bad assumption under normal circumstances. The M4 carbines that most soldiers carried were effective to maybe 300 meters in ideal conditions. At 475 meters, return fire would be more psychological comfort than actual threat. But Alara wasn't carrying an M4. And 475 meters wasn't extreme range for an M110 in the hands of someone who understood ballistics. She adjusted her elevation, compensating for the longer range and the uphill angle. The mathematical solution appeared in her mind without conscious calculation. Bullet drop, wind drift, target movement, all the variables resolving into a single point of certainty. These weren't training targets anymore. They were human beings, probably scared, definitely trying to kill the people she'd been assigned to protect. She felt no hatred toward them. No anger, just the cold understanding that their lives and the lives of the men around her existed in a zero-sum equation, and her job was to ensure the correct side of that equation survived. The first shot took out a machine gun team setting up in the tree line, the gunner collapsing across his weapon before it could be brought to bear. The second shot stopped a squad leader attempting to organize a renewed assault. 5 confirmed kills. The battle was barely 15 minutes old, and she'd already exceeded the total combat kills of some soldiers who'd served entire deployments. Sector 4 is clearing targets at 475 meters, Thorne reported to someone on a different frequency, probably battalion command or the withdrawal coordination element that was monitoring their situation. Enemy assault is breaking up. They're losing cohesion. Breaking up, but not broken. There were still over 100 combatants out there, and Alara had maybe 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition remaining in her immediate load. The tactical calculus was clear. She'd bought them time and disrupted the enemy's plan, but this wasn't over. Not even close. The dynamic had shifted, though. The enemy had come expecting to overwhelm a weakened defensive position with superior numbers and careful planning. Instead, they'd run into something they hadn't accounted for. A shooter who was systematically turning their assault into a demonstration of why professional marksmanship mattered in modern combat. Hollister was laughing, the slightly manic laugh of someone who'd been terrified 30 seconds ago and suddenly wasn't anymore. "They're running! Look at them scatter!" "They're not running," Calloway corrected, his voice calm despite everything. "They're repositioning, looking for angles that don't expose them to Sector 4's overwatch. They'll try again. Different approach, but they'll try." He was right. Through her scope, Alara could see enemy elements pulling back in good order, not routed but repositioning, officers and NCOs maintaining unit integrity even under pressure. These weren't militia fighters or insurgents with more enthusiasm than training. These were professionals, and professionals didn't quit just because their initial plan failed. At 0425 hours, 40 minutes into the engagement, the enemy stopped trying to assault the main defensive positions and did exactly what Alara would have done in their place. They went after the sniper. The first mortar round landed 30 meters to Sector 4's left, the explosions showering their position with rock fragments and centuries-old dust. Not accurate yet, but close enough to be concerning. The second round landed 15 meters to their right, the blast wave strong enough to feel as pressure against exposed skin. "They're walking rounds onto us," Hollister shouted, abandoning his fighting position to dive deeper into cover. "They're walking mortars onto our position." Walking rounds. The technique was as old as indirect fire itself. Fire one round, observe where it lands, adjust aim based on the miss distance, fire again. Each shot closer than the last, walking the impact point toward the target through iterative correction until eventually a round landed exactly where it needed to. And mortar teams that knew what they were doing could walk rounds with frightening speed. Dalton grabbed his radio. "4 to Thorn, we're taking indirect fire. We need to displace from this position." -4. Thorn's response was immediate and uncompromising. "If you move, they'll break through your sector. Hold position." "Sir, they're going to drop one right on top of us." "Then get low and pray, Sergeant. You move, they punch through, and the whole defensive line collapses. Hold your position." The third mortar round hit 8 meters away. The concussion wave felt like being punched in the chest by an invisible giant. Alara's ears rang despite hearing protection, the high-pitched whine that came from overpressure trauma drowning out other sounds temporarily. Dirt rained down like a localized weather event, covering her rifle, her equipment, her uniform. She wiped the optic clean with practiced efficiency, never leaving her firing position, even as Hollister and Dalton pressed themselves against the rock wall. Her hands moved automatically, clear lens, check 0, resume scanning, while her mind worked the problem. The enemy wanted her down, wanted her to abandon this position, either through death or through the survival instinct that told people to run when explosives started landing in their immediate vicinity. "Strand, get down!" Dalton yelled, his earlier confidence replaced by the specific fear that came from having no control over whether you lived or died. "They're targeting us specifically." "They want me down, Sergeant." Her voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system, despite the primal terror that came from knowing the next round might land directly on her head. "That's the point." Another round. Closer. Maybe 5 meters. The explosion lifted her slightly off her sandbag rest, rock fragments peppering the back of her helmet with sounds like violent hail. The next one would probably hit them directly, unless she stopped it first. She scanned the far ridge, looking for the telltale signature of a mortar position. The backblast created a distinctive visual effect, visible even at extreme range if you knew what to look for. The angle of the tube, the slight silhouette against the lighter sky, the movement of crew members around the firing position, anything that would give away their location and turn them from invisible threat into targetable enemy. There, a slight depression in the terrain, 580 meters distant. She could see the top of the mortar tube, the distinctive shape unmistakable once you knew where to look. The crew was moving around it, probably loading the next round, confident in their ability to adjust fire onto a target that couldn't shoot back at this range. They were wrong about that last part. 580 meters was extreme range for the M110. Not impossible, but extreme, especially in darkness, even with night vision, especially against a partially concealed target. The mathematics became more art than science at this distance, the variables piling up until certainty gave way to calculated risk. But the alternative was waiting for the next mortar round to land directly on their position and hoping the odds favored survival. She adjusted her elevation to compensate for the range and uphill angle. Windage hold required careful assessment. At this distance, even a slight breeze would push the bullet several inches off course. She watched dust patterns, felt the air on her face, made her best estimate of wind value, and translated it into hold. Not perfect information, but the best available under the circumstances. The rifle cracked. 580 meters away, one of the mortar crew jerked and fell. The mortars that had been walking steadily towards Sector 4's position suddenly started falling randomly, the remaining crew disrupted by the sudden, violent loss of their team leader, their careful fire adjustment abandoned in favor of just shooting and hoping. "Target eliminated." Alara's voice remained calm, professional, as if reporting weather conditions rather than an impossible shot. "Mortar team at 580 meters. Hollister's voice came from behind the rock wall where he'd taken cover. "I didn't even know we could shoot that far." "Most people can't," Calloway said quietly, looking at Alara with the particular respect that came from watching someone perform at a level you'd previously thought was theoretical rather than achievable. "But she's not most people." Eliminating the mortar team bought them breathing room, but it also made the enemy try something else. Professional fighters were nothing if not adaptable. If the direct assault failed, if supporting fires were neutralized, if the sniper couldn't be suppressed with indirect fire, then you went to the next option in the tactical playbook. You flanked. At 04:45 hours, Ilara spotted the flanking force. 30 combatants, maybe more, moving through dead ground along the dried riverbed, using terrain features to stay invisible to everyone except Sector 4. They were moving in a loose column formation, probably thinking they were safely concealed in the shadows and broken ground, heading toward a point that would put them in Sector 1's rear area. Once there, they could roll up the defensive line from behind, attacking positions that were oriented to defend against frontal assault, not rear attack. "Sector 4 to all positions," she transmitted with forced calm, watching the flanking force advance through her scope. "Enemy flanking force, 30-plus personnel, moving through the riverbed toward Sector 1's rear area. I can interdict." 4, this is 1. Thorne's voice carried confusion. "We don't see them. They're using the terrain for concealment, sir. Dead ground in the riverbed. But they'll emerge at grid November Victor 6-4 in approximately 3 minutes. When they reach that point, they'll be in your 6 o'clock with clear fields of fire into your rear positions." A pause. She could imagine Thorne processing that information, trying to verify it with his own observation, weighing whether to trust the assessment of a corporal he'd dismissed 12 hours ago versus his own inability to see the threat. Then Brennan's voice cut through. "Can you stop them, Corporal?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Not, "Can you shoot at them?" or "Can you slow them down?" Can you stop them? Can you eliminate this threat before it eliminates us? Can you do what needs to be done with the same precision you've demonstrated for the past hour? I can slow them down, sir, but I'll need the rest of four to cover my flanks while I'm engaged. If I'm focused on the riverbed, we're vulnerable to threats from other directions. Do it. 4. You have authorization to engage. All other sectors, be advised Sector 4 is engaging enemy flanking force in the riverbed. Stand by for potential enemy reaction. Ilara shifted her position slightly, getting a better angle down into the riverbed where the flanking force was moving. They were good. Maintaining noise discipline, using available cover, moving with the coordination that came from units that had trained together. But they'd made one critical assumption that proved fatal. They'd assumed the dried riverbed provided complete concealment from observation. It didn't. Not from Sector 4's elevated position. Not from someone who'd spent 12 hours studying this exact terrain, memorizing every fold in the ground, every boulder, every approach route. She took the lead man first, 340 meters. He was navigating for the column, probably the most experienced in terrain association, confident in his ability to guide them through dead ground. The shot was clean. One moment he was moving forward, the next he was down. The column stopped immediately, fighters dropping into cover, trying to understand what had just happened. Their concealment wasn't as good as they thought. Someone had eyes on them. Someone could shoot them. The realization rippled through the formation like electricity. She took the second man, then skipped to the rear of the column, identifying what looked like an officer or senior NCO directing the movement. He went down, clutching his chest, and with him went the flanking force's command and control. Contact! Contact in the riverbed! The shout came over the enemy frequency they'd been monitoring throughout the engagement. Arabic, but the meaning was clear from context and tone. They were confused, suppressed, their flanking maneuver collapsing into chaos before it had achieved its objective. The flanking force tried to continue forward, some fighters breaking cover to rush toward their objective. They exposed themselves to Ilara's field of fire and paid for it. Others tried to retreat, pulling back the way they'd come, only to run into a burst of machine gun fire from Sector 2 that had finally gotten a firing angle into the riverbed. Caught between precision fire from above and area fire from the flanking force dissolved as an organized unit. Flanking force neutralized, Ilara reported, already scanning for new threats even as she spoke. Sector 1's rear area is secure. Thorne's voice came back over the radio, and the skepticism that had colored his earlier transmissions was completely gone, replaced by something approaching awe. Outstanding work for, what's your ammunition status? Ilara performed a quick mental inventory. Rounds fired, rounds remaining in magazines, rounds in her immediate load-bearing equipment. The mathematics were simple, but concerning. 18 rounds, sir. Make them count. She planned to. In the brief lull that followed, the enemy regrouping, defenders catching their breath, both sides reassessing the tactical situation, Ilara's hands moved on autopilot, reloading magazines, organizing remaining ammunition for quick access, checking her rifle's function, all the mechanical tasks that kept weapons systems running while her mind drifted somewhere else entirely. She was 6 years old again, Montana summer, grasshoppers clicking in the afternoon heat, her grandfather's weathered hands guiding hers on the rifle stock, his voice patient and certain. You see that fence post, Ilara? You see how far away it is? She'd nodded, overwhelmed by the distance. Most people look at that distance and see impossible. You're going to look at it and see math. Wind, gravity, bullet drop. They're not obstacles. They're just problems with solutions, and you're good at solving problems. Hey, Hollister's voice interrupted her thoughts. He'd emerged from cover now that the immediate mortar threat had passed, though he still looked like he might dive back behind the rocks if he heard anything remotely concerning. That was incredible. The technical, the mortars, the flanking force. I've never seen anything like that. She nodded once, not quite looking at him, still scanning her sector for threats. Acknowledgement without encouraging conversation. She couldn't afford distraction right now. But then Calloway spoke, and he almost never spoke, so when he did, people listened. You saved us. All of us. We'd be dead right now if not for you. Alara finally looked at him, this quiet veteran who'd defended her from the beginning, who'd seen something in her that the others had missed. We saved each other. You held the perimeter while I engaged threats. That's how it's supposed to work. No, he shook his head slowly, deliberately. We held the line. You made sure there was still a line to hold. There's a difference. Before she could respond, Dalton appeared, moving low between rock formations, his face showing the strain of the past hour. He sat down heavily beside her position, and for a long moment he just stared out at the valley below, at the battlefield littered with evidence of violence, at the terrain that had proven so much deadlier than anyone expected. I was wrong about you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Sergeant, you were. He looked at her then, and she saw something in his expression that she'd seen before, in her grandfather's eyes when she'd made a particularly difficult shot. Respect. Genuine, unqualified respect. Not going to make it easy on me, are you? A small smile touched the corner of her mouth. Would you, Sergeant? He laughed, a short bark of sound that held no real humor, but carried the release of tension that had been building since the attack began. No, I wouldn't. Then his expression became serious again. Her name was Private Kendra Walsh, 21 years old. 3 years ago, different deployment, different country. I kept her in an observation post during a firefight, thought I was protecting her. She watched her squad get overrun from 200 meters away, couldn't help them, couldn't shoot, could only watch. Ilara said nothing, sensing there was more, that he needed to say this, needed to get it out. 3 months after we rotated home, she ate her weapon. Left a note, said she'd failed them, said she should have been there, should have been in the fight, should have done something other than observe while her friends died. His voice broke slightly. That wasn't her fault, that was mine. I made the call to keep her safe, and it killed her just as surely as if I'd pulled the trigger myself. Sergeant, I treated you the same way, he continued, needing to finish. Tried to keep you safe. Observation only. Don't shoot, don't engage, just watch. Would have gotten us all killed if you'd listened to me. If you'd followed my orders instead of doing what needed to be done. You gave permission when it mattered, Alara said quietly. Only because you made me see. He looked at her directly. You're not her. You're not anyone but yourself. And yourself is exactly who we needed tonight. He stood, moved back to his position, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her rifle, and the growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in how these men saw her. At 05:17 hours, with dawn just beginning to paint the eastern ridge with color, the enemy committed everything they had left in one final, desperate assault. They came in a human wave, 200 meters, 150 meters, using bodies to overwhelm defensive positions that couldn't possibly shoot fast enough to stop them all. It was the oldest tactic in warfare, mass in momentum overcoming firepower through sheer determination and acceptable casualties. And sometimes when the numbers were right and the defenders were exhausted and ammunition was running low, it worked. All sectors, this is it. Thorne's voice was ragged, pushed past professional calm into something approaching desperation. If they break through, we're done. Make every round count. Ilara's world became mechanical. Breathe, acquire, fire. Breathe, acquire, fire. She wasn't thinking about individual shots anymore, wasn't calculating wind and elevation for each engagement, just executing them. Her hands and eyes working in perfect synchronization, her body operating at a level where conscious thought would only slow her down. Each trigger pull felt inevitable, like she was simply observing bullets that had already decided to fly. 11 rounds left. A cluster of enemy fighters was setting up a heavy machine gun at 200 meters, a position that would enfilade sectors 1 and 2 simultaneously. If that gun opened up, it would cut the defensive line in half, suppress both positions while the assault wave rolled over them. Machine gun team, 200 meters, center of the riverbed, she transmitted while her crosshairs were already settling on the gunner. Engaging, someone replied. She didn't register who, probably trying to engage the same target. But their fire was missing, kicking up dirt 10 meters short. Range estimation failure, common in the stress of combat. Ilara's scope centered on the gunner. She fired. He dropped. The assistant gunner reached for the weapon, trying to take over. She fired again. He fell backward. 9 rounds. Gun is down, she reported, already scanning for the next threat. But 3 more enemy fighters were dragging the machine gun away, trying to recover it to a more protected position. Smart. That weapon was worth risking lives for. It could change the entire dynamic of the engagement if they got it into action. She took the lead man, then the second. The third abandoned the weapon and ran, finally understanding that staying anywhere near that particular piece of equipment meant death. 7 rounds. New threat. RPG teams setting up to hit Sector 2's bunker, the only hardened position left in the defensive line. 275 meters. The shooter was behind cover, only partially visible, but his partner, the man carrying the extra rockets, was exposed. Ilara had a decision to make in the fraction of a second she had available. Shoot the exposed ammo bearer and hope the team withdrew, or wait for the shooter to expose himself and risk the RPG launching. Certainty versus hope. Guaranteed effect versus potential effect. She chose certainty. The ammo bearer went down. The shooter hesitated, looking back at his fallen comrade. And in that moment of distraction, a burst from Sector 2's machine gun cut him down. 6 rounds remaining. Dawn fully breaking now. The darkness that had concealed the assault giving way to harsh morning light. Then she saw him. The enemy commander had to be. Moving between positions, directing fire, organizing what was clearly meant to be a final push against Sector 3's weakened position. He was hanging back at 520 meters, smart enough to stay out of the immediate kill zone, coordinating his forces from a position he thought was safe from engagement. He was wrong. Ilara adjusted for the extreme range, the dawn wind that had picked up with the temperature change, the uphill angle. This was the shot that would define the entire engagement. If she took him down, the assault would lose its coordination, would fracture into individual units fighting without central direction. If she missed, she'd wasted precious ammunition on an impossible shot. Dalton saw what she was targeting. That's too far. You'll never... She fired. 520 meters away, the enemy commander's chest exploded. He dropped instantly, and with him, the coherence of the assault collapsed. Small unit leaders tried to maintain momentum, but the coordinated attack that had been their final chance fractured into desperate individual rushes. 4 rounds left. The world seemed to slow. The enemy force was wavering. Sector 2's machine gun cut down a cluster of attackers. Sector 1's riflemen picked off stragglers trying to find cover. Hollister and Calloway were firing steadily from their positions, no longer panicked, just grimly working their sectors with professional efficiency. And Ilara kept shooting. 3 rounds. A squad leader trying to rally what was left of the assault. 2 rounds. A spotter still trying to call in their remaining mortars. 1 round. A fighter dragging a wounded comrade who stopped in her crosshairs. She paused. He was retreating. No longer a threat. Just a man trying to save a friend. She let him go. Her rifle clicked empty. Dalton stopped her from reloading. Save it. They're breaking. He was right. The enemy force was pulling back, dragging their wounded, abandoning equipment. The assault that was supposed to overwhelm the defensive line now reduced to a fighting retreat. The sun rose over a battlefield that told the story in brass and blood. An assault force of 200 had broken against a defensive line that should have collapsed, held together by professional soldiers and one sniper who'd been dismissed as just a girl 12 hours earlier. "Cease fire," Thorne ordered over the radio. "Cease fire! Let them go!" Ilara lowered her rifle, her hands trembling now that the crisis had passed, adrenaline finally catching up with action. They'd survived. Barely, but survived. The assault had failed. The defensive line had held, and tomorrow the withdrawal would continue as planned. But first, they had to count the cost. The sun rose over a valley transformed into a testament of violence. Smoke drifted across the terrain in lazy spirals, acrid and thick, carrying the smell of cordite and diesel fuel, and something else that soldiers recognized but never spoke about directly. Spent brass littered the ground around defensive positions like copper rain that had fallen during the night and refused to evaporate. Bloodstains darkened the rocks in places, already attracting flies despite the early hour. The technical vehicle sat silent on the outcropping where Ilara had predicted it would be, its gunner draped over the side like a grim flag, testament to what happened when professional soldiers ignored professional analysis. Ilara sat with her back against the rock wall, cleaning her rifle with methodical precision despite the exhaustion weighing on every muscle. Her hands moved through the familiar sequence: bore brush, cleaning patches, oil applied sparingly to moving parts, while her mind drifted in that peculiar aftermath state where the body continued functioning, but the consciousness needed time to process what had just occurred. The weapon had saved their lives, multiple lives. It deserved proper care. That was the contract between soldier and equipment. The unspoken understanding that if you maintain your tools with religious devotion, they would function when your life depended on it. Her grandfather had taught her that, had made her clean her rifle after every range session, even when she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open, even when the cleaning seemed unnecessary because the weapon had only fired a handful of rounds. "A rifle is like trust," he'd said, his weathered hands guiding hers through the disassembly process. "Easy to lose, hard to rebuild. You take care of it every single time, no exceptions, no shortcuts. Because the one time you skip the cleaning, the one time you think it doesn't matter, that's when it'll fail you. And failure downrange means someone doesn't come home." She'd never skipped a cleaning, not once in 3 years. And today, that discipline had paid dividends measured in lives saved. Captain Thorne appeared at Sector 4's position, his uniform torn and dirty, his face showing the particular exhaustion that came from commanding men through sustained combat. He'd aged a decade overnight, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture carrying weight that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. He looked at Ilara for a long moment before speaking, and she watched him visibly struggle with words that didn't come easily to officers who'd built careers on certainty. "How many?" he asked finally, his voice rough from shouting orders over radio and gunfire. 17 confirmed kills, sir, possibly more that I couldn't verify in the darkness or at extreme range." 17. He shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying disbelief despite having witnessed it himself, despite having authorized it, despite the evidence scattered across the battlefield below. Against an assault force of 200. The terrain helped, sir, channelized their movement patterns, limited their approach routes, created engagement areas where— "The terrain," he interrupted gently, then paused. "I'm told you tried to warn us about yesterday, about the outcropping, about their reconnaissance, about all of it." She didn't respond, didn't need to. The smoking technical vehicle on the eastern slope said everything that words couldn't. Thorne crouched beside her, grunting slightly as his knees protested the movement. Up close, she could see the red rims around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that came from adrenaline crash and exhaustion combined. "I owe you an apology, Corporal. We didn't give you a fair chance. We saw what we expected to see instead of what was actually there. That's failure of leadership on my part. That failure almost got us all killed. Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. I didn't need a fair chance, sir. Her gray eyes met his directly. No challenge in them, but no deference either. Just statement of fact. I just needed to do my job. Fair doesn't mean anything downrange. Only effective matters. He smiled faintly, the expression transforming his exhausted face into something almost peaceful. That's exactly why you're a better soldier than most of us. You understand what matters and what doesn't. He stood, joints popping audibly in the morning quiet. Battalion wants a full after-action report. I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. That's not necessary, sir. It's not about necessary, Strand. It's about right. You held this defensive line together through individual action and exceptional marksmanship. That deserves recognition, whether you want it or not. He started to leave, then turned back. And Strand, thank you for not listening to me when it mattered, for trusting your judgment over my orders. That takes courage that most people don't have. He walked away, leaving her alone with her rifle and her thoughts, and the growing awareness that something fundamental had changed in the past 6 hours. She'd proven something she'd been trying to prove her entire adult life, that competence transcended assumptions, that performance mattered more than preconceptions, that downrange the only evaluation that counted was whether you could do the job when lives depended on it. Sergeant Dalton approached, carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed her one without speaking, then sat down beside her with a heavy sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple physical exhaustion. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, both staring out at the valley below, where the evidence of the night's violence slowly became more visible in the strengthening daylight. I was wrong about you, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of genuine contrition rather than grudging admission. Yes, Sergeant, you were. He laughed, a short bark of sound that held both surprise and appreciation. Not going to make it easy on me, are you? Would you, Sergeant? No. He took a long drink of water, then continued. No, I wouldn't. For what it's worth, I've been in the Army 23 years, served with a lot of snipers, good ones who went on to special forces, ones who taught at the schoolhouse, ones with confirmed kills in double digits over entire deployments. He paused, looking at her directly. You're better than most of them. That technical shot at 280 meters while taking fire. The mortar team at 580 in darkness. That commander at 520 in dawn wind with an uphill angle. He shook his head. That wasn't luck. That was skill at a level most people never reach. It was math, Sergeant. Just ballistics and wind reading and trigger control. Nothing magical about it. Maybe, but there's a difference between knowing the math and executing it when people are shooting at you. When your position is taking mortar fire, when everything is chaos and fear, and you still make the shot. That's not just math. That's something else. Before Alara could respond, they heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters. Medical evacuation birds, their rotors thundering overhead as they headed for sectors 2 and 3, where the casualties were concentrated. The sound triggered something in her, a visceral reminder that while Sector 4 had survived intact, other positions hadn't been as fortunate. Hollister appeared, moving cautiously, as if the battlefield might suddenly come alive again despite the ceasefire. His baby face looked older somehow, marked by the night's experiences in ways that would probably become permanent. They're saying Sector 3 lost 4 KIA, 7 WIA. Sector 2 lost 2 KIA, 5 WIA. He paused, then added quietly, in Sector 4? 0 casualties, Dalton answered. The mathematics were cruel in their simplicity. The sectors with the most firepower, the most experienced soldiers, the best defensive positions, they'd suffered the most. The sector with one female sniper that everyone had dismissed, that had been designated observation only, that was supposed to stay out of the way, 0 casualties. The disparity wasn't just statistically significant, It was a rebuke to every assumption that had guided the defensive planning. Hollister looked at Alara with something approaching reverence. You saved all of us. Every single person in this sector would be dead or wounded right now if you hadn't been here. We saved each other, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. You and Calloway held the perimeter while I engaged threats. Dalton coordinated our response. That's how it's supposed to work. Nobody does it alone. But Calloway spoke up, his gravelly voice cutting through the morning air with the authority of experience. No, we held the line. You made sure there was still a line to hold. There's a difference, and it matters. He moved closer, sitting on a rock near her position, and for once his usual silence gave way to something that needed to be said. Iraq, 2006, had a convoy commander, Captain Rodriguez, female officer. Everyone doubted her, questioned whether she could handle combat leadership, whether she'd freeze under pressure, all the usual bullshit. He paused, looking out at the valley. Then insurgents hit us with a complex ambush. VBIEDs, RPGs, coordinated fire from multiple positions, everything going to hell simultaneously. And Captain Rodriguez drove us through it, kept her head, made decisions, saved 14 lives that day. He looked at Alara directly. Made major, still serving last I heard, still saving lives. You remind me of her. Not because you're both women, that's the least important thing about either of you, but because you're both warriors who happen to be women. There's a difference. Alara nodded slowly, understanding what he was trying to say. The distinction mattered. Not woman trying to be warrior, warrior who happened to be woman. The difference was subtle, but fundamental. People will doubt you at every assignment, Calloway continued. Every new base, every new mission, every time you show up somewhere new. They'll see your gender before they see your competence. That's not going to change anytime soon, probably not in your entire career. But you know what you can do? We know what you can do. And eventually, after enough nights like this, everyone else will know too. The medevac helicopters continued their work, ferrying wounded soldiers to field hospitals where surgeons would try to repair what violence had broken. Alara watched them, thinking about the men who hadn't made it, the ones who died in the first minutes of the assault before she'd been authorized to engage. Could she have saved them if Dalton had let her shoot immediately? If Thorne had trusted her tactical analysis about the outcropping? If anyone had believed her warnings about enemy reconnaissance? Probably not all of them, but maybe some. The weight of that possibility settled on her shoulders, not crushing, but present, a reminder that in combat, hesitation killed just as surely as enemy bullets. Every second spent debating, questioning, doubting, those were seconds that could have been spent acting, and in those seconds, men died. Hey, Hollister's voice was quiet, almost tentative. You did everything you could, more than anyone could have asked for. You can't carry the weight of decisions other people made, can't I? She looked at him, this young soldier who'd watched the whole thing unfold. I knew they were coming. I saw their reconnaissance. I identified the tactical vulnerabilities. I reported it all, and people still died because nobody believed me until it was too late. That's not on you, Dalton said firmly. That's on us, on me specifically. I'm the one who dismissed your warnings. I'm the one who kept you from engaging when you first identified threats. Those deaths are mine to carry, not yours. We can share the weight, Sergeant. Seems only fair. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I suppose we can. 3 days later, at battalion headquarters 20 kilometers from the forward operating base, Alara sat through the formal debriefing. The room was climate-controlled, a jarring contrast to the field conditions she'd been living in. Officers who'd never seen combat asked questions from prepared checklists, documenting every detail for after-action reports that would eventually make their way up the chain of command and into training materials for future soldiers. Shot placement, ammunition expenditure, rules of engagement compliance, Target identification procedures. Risk assessment protocols. They wanted metrics, wanted everything quantified and categorized, wanted to transform combat into data points that could be analyzed and replicated. She answered precisely, clinically, giving them the numbers they needed without the emotional context they couldn't understand. 17 confirmed kills, approximately 80 rounds fired, 0 friendly casualties in assigned sector, enemy assault defeated, mission accomplished. When the formal questioning was done, when she'd signed the last form and initialed the last acknowledgement, Lieutenant Brennan caught her in the hallway outside the briefing room. He looked uncomfortable, a posture she recognized from people who were about to apologize but weren't sure how. "I was your biggest doubter," he said without preamble. "Thought you'd be a liability. Thought having you on the line was a risk we couldn't afford. I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry." "Apology accepted, sir." He started to leave, then turned back, the question clearly eating at him. "That shot on the commander. 520 meters, dawn wind, uphill angle. That's a shot I wouldn't have taken. Not even attempted." "Why not, sir?" "Because I didn't think I could make it. The variables were too complex, the range too extreme, the conditions too uncertain. I would have let him go and engaged closer targets. Then I knew I could make it. That's the difference between us, sir." He smiled, the expression carrying respect rather than offense. Yeah, that's the difference. You saw a target that needed to be eliminated, and you eliminated it despite the difficulty. That's what separates good snipers from great ones. Knowing not just how to make the shot, but which shots need to be made, even when they're hard. Outside the headquarters building, she found Dalton smoking a cigarette, a habit he'd supposedly quit years ago, but that stress in combat had resurrected. He looked up as she approached, exhaling smoke into the morning air. "They're cutting orders," he said without greeting, "putting you in for advanced reconnaissance training. After that, probably special operations assignment. They want you somewhere your skills can be utilized at the highest level." "I just want to do my job, Sergeant." "Your job is wherever the Army needs the best. And Strand," he looked at her directly, "you're the best. Not the best female sniper, not good for someone your age. Just the best, period. The sooner you accept that, the easier everything else becomes." She nodded once, accepting the assessment without false modesty, but also without pride. It was simply a fact, proven in the laboratory that mattered, measured in the currency that counted. Downrange, where bullets were real and mistakes were permanent, she'd performed at a level that most soldiers never reached. That wasn't bragging. That was just observable reality. A young private approached, nervous energy radiating from him like heat. He couldn't have been more than 19, fresh-faced and uncertain. "Corporal Strand, I'm supposed to report to sniper school next month. I heard what you did out there. I was wondering if you had any advice." Ilara considered the question, thinking about her grandfather's ranch, about endless practice sessions, about every doubting voice she'd overcome, about every obstacle that had been placed in her path with the justification that it was for her own good, or for unit cohesion, or for maintaining standards. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of experience earned through years of proving people wrong. "Let the target tell you. If you can hit it, you can hit it. Details that fade when bullets fly. Politics, opinions, assumptions. When you're looking through a scope at something that needs to be hit, only one question matters. Can you make the shot or can't you? That's the only evaluation that counts downrange." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." He hurried away, probably eager to share the wisdom he'd received from the sniper, who'd made 17 confirmed kills in one engagement. Dalton exhaled smoke and looked at her with something like paternal pride. "You're going to inspire a lot of people. You know that?" "I'm not trying to inspire anyone. I'm just trying to shoot." "That's exactly why it'll work. You're not preaching, not making speeches, not trying to prove political points. You're just doing the job at a level that demands respect. That's more powerful than any amount of rhetoric. Ilara returned to her temporary barracks to pack her gear for movement to the next assignment, wherever that might be. Her rifle lay on the bunk, freshly cleaned, ready for whatever came next. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, the balance that came from thousands of hours of practice, the certainty that came from knowing this weapon would function when she needed it, because she'd maintained it properly every single time. She thought about the radio transmission from 3 days ago. Just a girl. The words had been dripping with contempt, with dismissal, with the assumption that her presence on the line was a liability rather than an asset. Just a girl who'd been given a position out of political correctness rather than tactical necessity. Just a girl who'd held a defensive line against 200 attackers. Just a girl who'd made 17 confirmed kills in one engagement, including shots that most trained snipers wouldn't attempt. Just a girl who'd proven that the only thing that mattered downrange was whether you could perform when lives depended on it. The doubt would follow her to the next assignment, and the next after that. She understood that now, accepted it as the price of being different, of challenging assumptions, of operating in spaces where people didn't expect to see someone who looked like her. Let it follow. She'd proven herself once against impossible odds. She could do it again, and again, and again, until the day came when just a girl became just the best, and nobody questioned it anymore. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Dalton, heard you're top of your class already at the training pipeline. Not surprised. Stay safe out there. She typed back, will do, Sergeant. Thanks for giving me the shot when it mattered. His response was immediate. You gave yourself the shot, Strand. I just stopped standing in the way. She smiled at that, recognizing the truth in it. She had given herself the shot through years of preparation that nobody saw, through practice sessions that nobody witnessed, through maintaining standards when it would have been easier to quit, through refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose. 6 months later, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Special Operations Training Facility, where the Army sent soldiers who'd proven themselves worthy of advanced instruction. The range stretched for 1,000 meters, marked at intervals with steel targets that rang like bells when hit properly. Ilara stood at the firing line with 12 other snipers, all male, all experienced, all watching her with the particular attention that came from reputation preceding presence. The instructor called out the parameters. Strand, you're up. 800 meters, 15-mile-per-hour crosswind, 30-degree uphill angle. Target is the standard silhouette at the 800-meter line. You've got 60 seconds to make the shot from the moment I give the command. She settled into position, building her shooting platform with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this sequence so many times it had become muscle memory rather than conscious action. Sandbag adjusted, stock to shoulder, eye to scope. The world narrowed to the circle of magnified vision where the target waited, small and distant, but defined. She breathed, calculated wind value from flags at intervals along the range, adjusted her elevation for the distance and uphill angle, built the ballistic solution in her mind, bullet drop at 800 meters, wind drift compensation, the slight canting of the rifle to account for the Coriolis effect at extreme range. Not conscious math anymore, just instinct built from thousands of rounds fired, from practice sessions that had started at age 6 and never really stopped. The instructor gave the command. She fired. The sound of the shot echoed across the range, followed 3 seconds later by the distinctive ring of steel. Hit, center mass. One of the male snipers whistled low. Damn, that was fast. She didn't even take the full minute. The instructor approached, his weathered face showing the kind of professional interest that came from recognizing exceptional performance. Strand, you didn't take the full 30 seconds to set up and confirm your solution. Most shooters use the entire time to ensure accuracy. Why didn't you? Didn't need it, sir. Why not? because I knew the shot before I took position. The wind reading, the elevation adjustment, the holdovers, I calculated all of that while waiting for my turn. By the time you gave the command, the only thing left was execution. The rest was confirmation of what I already knew. He stared at her for a long moment, then smiled. A rare expression from an instructor who'd spent 20 years teaching snipers and had seen every variation of talent and dedication. That's what separates good snipers from great ones. Understanding that shooting is 10% trigger pull and 90% preparation. Most people spend their time on the trigger. You spend yours on everything that comes before. Welcome to the team, Corporal. That evening, in the barracks, her phone buzzed again. Dalton, staying in touch despite the distance and different assignments. Heard you're top of your class already. Not surprised. Knew you would be from the moment you made that 520-meter shot. Stay safe out there. She typed back, "Will do. Thanks for giving me the shot when it mattered." His response came immediately. "You gave yourself the shot, Strand. I just stopped standing in the way. That's all any of us can do. Recognize talent when we see it and get out of the way so it can work. You didn't need my permission. You just needed me to stop preventing you from doing what you were trained to do." She set the phone down and walked to the range one last time before lights out. The evening was quiet, the other students having already returned to the barracks. She stood at the firing line alone, looking downrange at targets that waited in the growing darkness. She set up at the 520-meter line, the same distance as the enemy commander, the shot that had defined everything. Dawn-wind simulation fans created crosswind conditions. An elevated platform provided the uphill angle. Every variable replicated from that morning in Afghanistan when she'd proven what she'd always known, that she belonged here, had always belonged here, would always belong here. She breathed, calculated, fired. The target rang. Perfect hit. She didn't celebrate, didn't need to, just knew, with a certainty that came from truth rather than hope, that she belonged in this world. The world of precise violence, of mathematical certainty, of problems that could be solved if you understood the variables and executed properly. She'd proven it to herself at age 6 when she'd first hit that tin can at 300 yards. She'd proven it to the Army at sniper school when she graduated top of her class. She'd proven it at FOB Sentinel when 17 enemy combatants had learned the hard way that dismissing her was fatal. She didn't need to prove it anymore, but she would, again and again, because that was the price of being different, of challenging assumptions, of operating in spaces where people didn't expect to see someone like her. Each new assignment would bring new doubts, new skeptics, new people who saw her gender before they saw her competence. Let them doubt. She'd turn their skepticism into certainty, their dismissal into respect, their assumptions into statistics measured in confirmed kills and zero friendly casualties and successful missions that couldn't be explained away or attributed to luck. They'd called her just a girl when she'd arrived at FOB Sentinel, had whispered about diversity quotas and lowered standards, and whether she'd be a liability when it mattered, had given her observation duty because they didn't trust her with anything important, had ignored her warnings because they couldn't believe someone so young, so new, so female could possibly see what they'd missed. But when 200 enemy combatants had attacked in coordinated assault, when the defensive line had started to collapse, when seasoned veterans had been suppressed and positions had been overrun, just a girl had become the only thing standing between survival and slaughter. 17 confirmed kills. One impossible 520-meter shot that had decapitated enemy command structure. 0 casualties in her sector. A Silver Star recommendation that would eventually be approved. Orders to special operations where her skills would be utilized at the highest level. Just a girl who'd proven what her grandfather had taught her at age 6 on a Montana ranch under endless sky, that the only opinion that mattered was the targets. And if you could hit it, you could hit it. Sometimes just a girl was exactly what you needed to stay alive. Sometimes the person everyone dismissed turned out to be the person everyone needed. Sometimes competence mattered more than assumptions. Performance mattered more than prejudice. Results mattered more than expectations. She'd proven it once. She'd prove it again, as many times as necessary, until the day came when nobody asked her gender before asking how many targets she could hit. Until the day when just a girl became just the best, and the distinction no longer mattered because everyone understood what she'd always known. Downrange, only one thing mattered. Could you make the shot when someone's life depended on it? She could. She always had. She always would. She walked back to the barracks under a sky full of stars, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her grandfather's scope still mounted on top. The same glass that had seen Desert Storm, now seeing a new generation of soldiers proving themselves in new conflicts. The legacy continuing, the standards maintained, the tradition of excellence passed from one generation to the next, regardless of gender or background or anyone's expectations about who could or couldn't do this work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubters, new opportunities to prove what she'd already proven 100 times. She was ready. She'd always been ready, from the moment her 6-year-old hands had first gripped a rifle too big for her. From the moment her grandfather had recognized something in her eyes that most people never saw, she'd been preparing for this. And now, finally, everyone else was starting to see it too. Just a girl, just the best. The distance between those phrases, measured in confirmed kills, successful missions, lives saved, and assumptions shattered. A distance she'd traveled through dedication and discipline, and the refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time in her military career, she walked forward knowing that she'd proven what needed to be proven. That the doubt would still come but would matter less with each successful engagement. That eventually the question wouldn't be whether she could do the job, but simply where she was needed most. 17 confirmed kills in one engagement, 0 casualties in her sector, a defensive line held against impossible odds. These weren't just statistics, they were proof, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away or attributed to anything except competence executed at the highest level under the worst possible conditions. They'd called her just a girl. She'd shown them what that girl could do. And in the process, she'd proven what her grandfather had always known, what she'd known since age 6, but that the world had needed to see to believe. That warriors came in all forms, that competence transcended assumptions, that downrange, the only thing that mattered was whether you could make the shot when everything depended on it. She could. She always had. She always would.